The day they read my husband's inventory at the probate office in Bannack, Montana territory, the cold was only around 5 degrees Celsius, but everyone in that room understood a truth simpler than law and harsher than church. In this land, late October is no longer autumn. It is winter's final warning. Bannack still wore the look of a gold town, trying to prove it wasn't dead, with its rows of darkened log buildings, frozen mud on the paths, chimney smoke rising low and fast under a lead-gray sky, and the sound of boots on the office's wooden floor like knocks on a coffin lid. I stood at the front of the room in a borrowed black dress, too wide at the shoulders and tight across the chest, my hands cold to numbness but steady, listening to the county clerk read each item Nathan Wren had left behind, line by line, in the flat voice of a man accustomed to turning lives into paperwork. A 2-room cabin in Beaverhead County, on the mountainside above the old trail down to Grasshopper Creek, 12 acres of rock and slope, a cracked cast-iron stove, a few rusted tools, an unpaid balance on building materials, a reinforced cellar beneath the kitchen floor, no outdoor woodpile at the time of inventory. The room erupted in laughter at that last line, not the awkward chuckle of decent people unsure how to show pity. The head thrown back, teeth-baring, pleasure-soaked laughter of those who had waited years to see a dire prediction come true. In Montana, especially around Beaverhead, a family surviving an ordinary winter needed at least 6 to 8 cords of wood. Anyone who had lived through a wind-lashed season on bare slopes knew the real number was 10. Even 12 cords if winter arrived early or snow blocked the roads before Thanksgiving. The cold here didn't just bite skin. It ate into walls, seeped under floors, froze water in buckets next to the stove, and turned a small mistake in October into certain death by January. So, when they heard I had inherited a mountainside cabin with no woodpile in the yard, they didn't see inconvenience. They saw a sentence already passed. A man near the window spat into the sandbox and said loud enough for everyone to hear that a woman with rock, debt, and no woodpile in Beaverhead was no different from being handed a hole and told to lie down in it. Another recalled how Nathan had dug earth and hauled wood at night as if hiding stolen gold. While the price of a cord that season around Bannack ran $3 to $5 depending on type and dryness, and Nathan had poured nearly everything he had into what they called making wood disappear. They laughed the way a community laughs at what it doesn't understand but has already decided is foolish. They called him a pointless hoarder, a doomsday digger, a man acting like the sky would freeze the whole world when all a normal person needed was to split wood, tarp it, and pray winter wouldn't last too long. Nathan had been dead 3 weeks. I was 18. We had been married less than a year, and now I stood there, in Bannack, in a room smelling of damp ledgers, ink, leather, and hearth ash, hearing his name invoked like an old joke finally confirmed. Mrs. Beatrice Holloway sat at the front table, back straight, silver hair tightly pinned, steel-rimmed glasses perched precisely on the bridge of her nose, as if born to judge others. I had known her before I knew what ownership or marriage or debt meant. She had managed the orphan relief records at Street Ruth House, signing the papers that moved me from one roof to another like misplaced furniture. She looked at me through those glasses, then down at the paper in her hand, and spoke in a voice soft enough to stay polite but clear enough to tear a person apart. Clara Wren, it appears your husband has left you exactly what decent people fear most in Montana. A roof without fuel, a mountainside without value, and a winter coming on. Those nearby laughed again. She did not. She didn't need to. People like Beatrice Holloway never have to raise their voice to make others feel small. She merely tilted her head slightly, as if reviewing an old file, and reminded everyone that I had passed through at least 4 homes in 3 years, that I did not fit normal life, that I had the habit of looking at ledgers, remembering figures, fixing things no one asked to have fixed, and making the adults around me feel exposed in corners they preferred hidden. My aunt in Virginia City said I ate like a minor. The Suttons needed a babysitter, not a girl pointing out their miscalculation of winter flower. At Street Ruth House, candles were locked after supper, so children wouldn't waste light reading what no one asked them to. The Haskins returned me in under 2 months after I accidentally corrected a seed column in front of their guests. I wasn't hated for laziness. I was passed on because I saw too much and remembered too clearly. Nathan was the first who did not see that as a flaw. He asked what I thought of the slope behind the house. Asked why the flour in the barrel had dampened before the rain. Asked how long it took me to memorize the trail from Bannack down to Grasshopper Creek. He did not silence my mind to endure it. He used it like a good tool. That was so rare I didn't know what to call it then, except the feeling of breathing without being scolded for wasting air. When Beatrice Holloway said I lacked the ability to survive independently, the room nearly accepted it as reasonable conclusion. Perhaps because they remembered me as the child shifted between houses. Perhaps because they saw a young widow with no money, no family, no woodpile. Perhaps because they saw nothing beyond appearances. And appearances then were indeed simple. A cabin in Beaverhead County, on a wind-swept slope near Grasshopper Creek, winter capable of -30°C, and a woman alone who could not last 30 days without a woodpile in the yard. I had seen what that cold could do. Winter of 1872, my father died on a wood wagon when a wheel locked in ice at a steep curve. Temperature that day dropped below -20°C. Horses panicked, wagon tilted, logs slid, and his chest was crushed before anyone could pry the wheel from the frozen rut. I understood the value of fuel before I understood the value of money. A family could lack tablecloths, chairs, unbroken window glass, but not wood. Not in these mountains, not at the end of October. So when the clerk read the line about the reinforced cellar beneath the kitchen floor, something in me shifted. Nathan never let anyone touch the floor behind the kitchen table legs. He replaced those boards twice himself. He once lost his rare temper when a hide trader tracked mud across that exact corner. I remembered it as clearly as my father's face the last time, and amid the laughter, amid Holloway's pitying gaze, amid all the pre-stamped verdicts on my fate, I suddenly felt my mind move from endurance to calculation. If Nathan had done something under that kitchen floor, he was not mad. If he had sunk nearly all his money into wood that disappeared, it had not disappeared. Others simply didn't know where to look. I left the probate office into Bannack's midday cold, walking the narrow, muddy boardwalk street, hearing behind me people still saying I would return to town before the first snow-covered Deadwood Gulch. Perhaps they truly believed no woodpile meant no chance of surviving more than 30 days in Montana. Perhaps they were right for most people, but as I passed through the door and the first winter wind struck my face, I knew I would return to the cabin. I would return to Beaverhead County, up the slope they called the Wren Winter Grave, and if my husband had truly buried my future in the ground, I would be the one to dig it up. I left Bannack before the sun had fully cleared the gray log roofs, riding on the back of a freight wagon headed south into Beaverhead County, where the road gradually narrowed to a dirt track and then to trails only longtime residents still remembered. No one traveled with me except the driver, and he took me only to a point about 10 or 12 miles from the cabin before turning back. Because beyond that, the way was no longer a road but a series of rocky climbs, tree roots, and frozen mud where wheels no longer mattered and feet alone decided whether you reached your destination. Daytime temperature hovered around 2°C, cold enough to creep inside collars and sleeves, numbing fingers if left bare too long, and the driver said nights could drop below -10°C, with the felt temperature even lower if north wind swept the open slopes. When he stopped at a crooked old post marking a fork, he pointed to a narrow path climbing the mountainside, said 3 hours' walk along it would reach the small valley where the cabin sat, then looked at me a moment as if he wanted to say something more before pulling his hat lower and turning the wagon around. I stood alone with a valise so light it felt empty and began walking. The path climbed steadily, some stretches soft with old snow melted and refrozen, some slick rock, some requiring hands on tree trunks to pull up. And the higher I went, the thinner the trees, the stronger the wind, the drier the air until each deep breath scraped my throat lightly from inside. After about 4 hours, as the sun began lowering and light turned pale gold, I saw the valley. It was not wide, just a hollow between steep slopes, but enough to trap cold and shadow longer than anywhere around it. The cabin sat at the north edge of the hollow, facing away from the light, as if placed there not to greet the day but to await the long night. I stood on the slope looking down, and the first thing I searched for was not the roof or windows but the woodpile. In Montana, a woodpile told everything you needed to know about a family. Whether they prepared, whether they understood winter, whether they would reach spring. But before me was only bare, hard, dark ground. No trace of any stack, no bark, no sawdust, no fresh chopping scars nearby. That contradicted everything about Nathan having lived here through at least 2 consecutive winters. No one survived 2 Beaverhead winters without cutting wood unless they did not survive the second. I walked down, each step ringing on the hard earth, and when I stood before the cabin, the first feeling was not fear but something close to emptiness. The roof sagged slightly to one side, the chimney leaned, the door had small cracks where wind could slip through, and the front yard was so empty it almost made a sound of silence. I opened the door, and the smell inside was old ash, faintly damp wood, dust, and the dry scent of places once warmed but no longer used. Inside were only basics: a small cast-iron stove against the wall, a low wooden table, mismatched chairs, a bed with an old frame, and a few empty shelves. No wood stacked by the stove, no wood basket, no sign of prepared fuel. I knelt beside the stove, opened the firebox, saw the layer of old ash from the last burn, then looked around for anything that would burn. Eventually, I gathered a few splinters, a handful of small remnants from a corner, and used them to start a weak fire. The flames caught slowly, unsteadily, and the heat they gave barely lifted the cabin air from 0 to perhaps 2 degrees Celsius, a temperature bearable for a few hours in enough layers but impossible to maintain for days, especially when outside could fall to minus 25 degrees Celsius or lower, once true winter arrived. When the sun set, cold poured in faster than I expected, as if it had only waited for light to vanish before claiming the entire space. I wrapped myself in the old blanket, sat as close to the stove as possible, and listened to wind batter the cracks, the small fire snap, and my own heart beat steady in my chest. That first night in the cabin, I did not sleep the way people usually call sleep. I closed my eyes, but my body stayed on alert, as if one more degree of drop would wake it to move, to generate warmth, to avoid freezing. In the intervals between opening my eyes, I thought of what people had said in Bannack, thought of the 6 to 8 chord figure for a winter, thought of 10 to 12 chords in wind-swept places like this, and thought of the reality that I had not 1 chord above ground. I was not afraid in a panicked way. I was afraid in a calculating way. If I continued with this meager fuel, I might keep the cabin warm for 1 or 2 more nights, 3 at most with extreme rationing. But after that, without a steady source of wood, my body would lose heat faster than it could produce it, and death would come not as shock but as a slow, cold, certain process. 3 to 5 days, that was the time I gave myself. Not to hope, but to find the answer to the only question that mattered here. What had Nathan burned to survive the winters before? On the second night, I stopped trying to sleep, because my body had already understood that lying still only let the cold advance faster, and my mind began working the way it always did when everything around turned dangerous. It went back over every small detail, every habit, everything others overlooked. I sat close to the stove, watching the weak flame fade from lack of fuel, then looked down at the wooden floor behind the table legs, the exact spot Nathan always kept cleaner than the rest, always avoided letting anyone step on, always placed a chair slightly askew as if by accident to hide something. I pulled the chair aside, knelt, and brushed away the thin layer of dust, ash, and accumulated scraps with my hand until my fingertips touched something cold and round. An iron ring, set flush into the floorboard. Not something put there for decoration, nor anything needed in an ordinary kitchen. I gripped it, pulled up, and the board lifted with a low creak, revealing darkness below. A steady, cool draft, completely different from the sharp, dry cold outside, brushed my face. I struck a match, lit the last candle, and climbed down. The cellar was not deep, but deep enough to be entirely separate from surface temperatures. The air here hovered between 4 and 7 degrees Celsius. The range I knew was ideal for preserving food, not cold enough to freeze, not warm enough to spoil. Around me were a few nearly empty sacks of flour, some shriveled potatoes, a few jars of salt and vinegar, all looking like an ordinary cellar. But at the far end, where the candlelight reached the wall, I saw something that did not belong in a food store. A secondary door, made of thick wood 5 to 7 inches, edged with metal bars, and secured by a heavy crossbar that took both hands to lift. No one reinforced a door like that just to keep potatoes. I stood in front of it for a few seconds, feeling as though I were standing before something that, once opened, would force everything I knew about Nathan to change. Then I pulled the bar, pushed the door, and stepped through. The candlelight at first showed only a narrow passage, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized I was standing in a tunnel 6 to 10 meters long, tall enough for one person to walk upright, with a reasonably low ceiling. The walls on both sides were not raw earth, but dry stone masonry. Each stone fitted tightly without mortar, leaving small gaps for slow air movement and moisture to escape. The floor was hard-packed dirt, sloping gently to one side so water would not pool. The air here was not as cold as outside, nor as damp as a sealed earth cave. It was dry, still, and carried the scent of wood properly kept over time. I took a few more steps, raised the candle higher, and the light revealed what all of Bannack had laughed at, as if it did not exist. Wood, not a few pieces, not a small stack, but an entire system. Logs stacked in clear compartments, each chest-high, several meters long, separated by wooden and stone supports. I approached one compartment, touched a log, then lifted two and tapped them together. The sound rang sharp, dry, almost metallic. I had heard that sound before, from wood properly seasoned over many months. Moisture dropped below 20%, reaching the seasoned firewood, standard any stove user understood the value of. Such wood burned hotter, cleaner, and 30 to 50% more efficiently than green wood. I walked along the tunnel, and the farther I went, the clearer the quantity became. This was not a wood pile. This was around 20 cords, 70 to 80 cubic meters, carefully organized by type. Small kindling for quick starts, medium for daytime maintenance, large heavy oak for slow all-night burns, and a deeper section, marked with charcoal on stone, likely the emergency reserve. Along the ceiling and walls I saw vent shafts, 10 to 15 centimeters in diameter, leading up to the surface somewhere on the hillside. Air moved slowly through them, enough to keep humidity in the space low, around 15 to 20%, preventing mold and keeping the wood in prime condition. Near the door was a small wooden chest. I opened it, and inside were ledgers. One older, handwriting not Nathan's, probably Elias Wren's, and another thicker one, Nathan's. I opened Nathan's, and the first page was numbers. Daily burns, weekly, monthly. Fuel consumed under normal conditions. High winds, temperatures below -25. Calculations showed the cabin needed roughly 0.15 to 0.25 cord per week in harsh winter, depending on heat retention and stove use. With 20 cords in storage, used sensibly, the system could keep the place warm for 2 to 3 years, longer with extreme conservation. I sat right on the dirt floor, candle beside me, still holding a log, and for the first time since standing in the probate room in Bannack, I understood something none of them did. Nathan did not lack wood. He had more than anyone in the region. He did not stack it outside for people to see and judge. He buried it underground, where wind could not reach, snow could not cover, thieves would not think to look, and weather could not steal its value. He had not prepared for an ordinary winter. He prepared for what people laughed and called doomsday, but which was really just a winter bad enough to stop everything familiar from working. In that moment, all the laughter, the looks, the judgments in Bannack shrank, not because they were entirely wrong, but because they saw only the surface. Nathan, called mad, had built a system even I, standing here, took time to fully grasp. I do not know how long I sat in that tunnel, only that when I returned with the ledger in hand, the candle had burned nearly to the end, and the air around me still held that strange, stable feeling the outside never had. I carried both ledgers up to the cabin, set them on the table, struck the last matches for more light, and began reading as though they were not records of the dead, but the only remaining instructions for me to survive this winter. The older one, paper yellowed and edges frayed, belonged to Elias Wren, Nathan's father. The early pages had no explanations or introductions, just dates and short, coldly precise lines. Winter 1859. 3 families south of Grasshopper Creek lost over half their livestock, when temperatures stayed below minus 25 degrees Celsius for days. Hay ran out, wood insufficient to keep barns warm, 1,861. 2 herds froze after a 4-day blizzard. High winds collapsed fences. People could not reach woodpiles because of thick ice cover, 1,863. Up to 70% livestock loss in some households from lack of both fuel and feed. Not because they had no wood, but because wood could not be used when most needed. Elias did not write like a storyteller. He recorded like someone measuring failure. Each number, each cause, each weather condition, repeating one conclusion across pages without emphasis. The problem was not how much wood you had, but when and how you could use it. In later pages, he began noting something I had never thought of this way before. Outdoor woodpiles, even stacked high and tarped, still lost 20 to 30% burning efficiency from increased moisture and freezing during deep cold spells. When temperatures fluctuated around freezing then plunged, the outer layers of logs held water, froze solid, and when brought inside the stove, the first energy went to melting ice and evaporating water instead of producing heat. That not only reduced heat output but created thick smoke, clogged chimneys, and lowered overall system efficiency. Elias recorded the numbers, the trials, the days he had to burn damp wood and measured ash, smoke, and time needed to reach the same heat level as dry wood. On one page, he wrote that in high winds, when speeds exceeded 40 to 60 kilometers per hour, fetching wood from an outdoor pile became a real risk, not just from cold, but because a person simply could not work efficiently in that environment, and every time the cabin door opened meant significant heat loss. I turned to Nathan's ledger, and the difference was clear. If Elias recorded the problem, Nathan built the answer. His early pages summarized his father's observations, but quickly moved to design and testing. He drew simple diagrams of an underground store, marking depth, wind direction, vent placement, noting that 1 to 2 meters of overlying soil could act as natural insulation, keeping temperatures stable year-round regardless of surface changes. He recorded temperatures at different depths compared to outside air and showed that stability was the key to fuel preservation. In following pages, Nathan went into detail on the system I had just stood in. He wrote about airflow control through small vents, enough for slow movement to prevent moisture buildup without losing heat. He noted keeping humidity below about 20% so wood stayed seasoned and ready to burn efficiently. He discussed arranging wood by type and purpose so no deep digging was needed in bad conditions, and keeping a reserve never touched unless everything else failed. On a page near the middle, he wrote a sentence I had to read twice to be sure I understood. Wind does not take your wood. It takes your ability to use your wood. And right below, he noted that when winds exceeded 40 to 60 kilometers per hour, especially with snow or ice, an outdoor woodpile was nearly useless to someone living alone because each trip outside consumed more energy than the heat recoverable from the wood brought in. I set the ledger down, looked toward the kitchen floor where the door to the cellar lay silent as though it had always been there waiting for me to understand. What Elias and Nathan did was not hoard more than others. They changed the entire way of looking at fuel. They did not treat wood as something left outside waiting to be used. They treated it as a system to be protected, managed, and maintained in optimal conditions. Thermal mass of the earth kept temperature stable. Airflow control kept air moving just enough. Moisture management kept wood dry and efficient. Those 3 factors together created what all of Bannock laughed at without understanding. A reserve that not only existed but worked precisely when most needed. I realized the question I had carried from the first night what Nathan had burned to survive previous winters already had its answer. He did not burn anything special. He simply ensured that when he needed to burn, what he had was always in the best possible state. And in a land where the smallest mistake could kill a family, that difference was not a detail. It was the line between living and dying. What I read in those 2 ledgers did not stop the winter or soften the cold outside, but it changed how I saw each passing day in that cabin, as though I no longer faced something vague but confronted a problem with a solution, even if that solution demanded more than just reading and understanding. By early December 1876, temperatures began dropping to levels people in Bannock called deep cold, when daytime rarely rose above minus 15 degrees Celsius and nights regularly hit minus 25 degrees Celsius, even minus 30 degrees Celsius during strong wind sweeps through Beaverhead County. North winds poured down bare slopes, carrying dry cold that turned every crack in the cabin into an escape route for heat. In those conditions, fire was no longer something for comfort. It was the only thing keeping water from freezing solid, keeping limbs movable, keeping life from quietly leaving the body. I began maintaining fire almost continuously, not by burning big, but by keeping a stable coal bed, adding wood at the right time, right type, right amount. The 20 cords underground, mocked by all of Bannock as waste, now stood between me and death. But very quickly I realized fuel was not the only issue. Food began running short first. The flour sacks in the cellar dwindled, potatoes shriveled, and each day I calculated intake the way Nathan had calculated wood. My daily ration fell to about 1,200 to 1,500 calories, mostly from thin cornmeal mush, a little potato, and hot water for someone chopping wood, hauling wood, tending fire, and repairing the cabin. That energy was far below actual need, and my body began to respond. I lost weight fast, clothes hung loose at shoulders and hips, hands cracked, and sometimes standing up too quickly blackened my vision and forced me to grip the table to avoid falling. But if I ate more, food would run out before winter ended, and then even with all that wood, I would lack strength to use it. I returned to Nathan's ledger, this time not just reading about the store, but about using it. He noted clearly that fuel consumption was not a fixed number, but a variable depending on cabin heat retention. Better heat retention could significantly reduce wood burned. I began trying small things I had not considered before. I blocked cracks with old cloth, used dirt and ash to seal drafts under baseboards, hung extra fabric inside the door to create an air buffer. I rearranged sleeping position, moving the bed closer to the stove, reducing space to warm. I never let the fire die completely at night, keeping a thick coal layer enough that a few small sticks could bring it back. Gradually, I reduced consumption to about 0.02 cord per day, a figure that, if sustained, would stretch the fuel supply far longer than ordinary burning. But reducing wood use did not solve the bigger problem approaching. By mid-January, after weeks of eating below need, my body began failing to respond as before. There was one week I remember clearly, not because anything special happened outside, but because inside I nearly collapsed. I woke one morning, tried to stand to rebuild the fire, and realized my legs would not hold my weight for the first few seconds. I had to kneel, wait for circulation to return, before I could stand. My hands shook, holding the axe, not from cold but from lack of energy. I boiled water, cooked thinner mush than usual, and while eating realized I no longer felt hunger clearly, only a spreading fatigue as though my body were shutting down piece by piece. I sat by the stove, staring into the fire, and for a moment the thought of leaving the cabin came not as a decision but as release. Bannock, despite the people who laughed, still had food, people, bigger hearths, but right after, another thought came, colder and clearer. If I left in this condition, on iced and snow-covered mountain trails, I might never reach town. I would die midway, with no fire, no shelter, no second chance. I pulled Nathan's ledger close again, turned past pages I had only skimmed before, and this time looked for something other than wood. I looked for food, and there, among fuel notes, he left short lines about things winter did not kill. He noted winter sorrel growing in damp soil near streams, chickweed findable under thin snow and wind-scoured patches, cattail roots in marshes not fully frozen. He noted relative locations, distances from cabin, directions, identifying signs. The next day, in cold still at -20 degrees Celsius, I layered more clothing, took the knife, and went outside not to chop wood but to find what I had never thought I would need to find in winter. The first steps were slow and heavy, but each was a choice to continue instead of stop. I did not find much, only a few small leaves, some roots, enough to add to hot water and make something taste different from thin mush. It did not make me strong again immediately, but it did something more important. It kept my body from falling below the threshold of no return. And in that small cabin, in the middle of a Montana winter where temperatures could still drop to -30 degrees Celsius any night, I began to understand that Nathan had not left me only a wood store. He left me a different way of seeing survival, where everything, from logs to tiny grass blades under snow, was part of a larger system, and my task was not to fight winter but to learn how to exist inside it. The final days of February stretched like a taut wire, neither snapping nor ever slackening, and when March 1877 arrived, the cold no longer raged as fiercely but became dangerous in a different way, quieter, damper, and more unpredictable. Snow no longer fell heavily, but short daytime thaws melted the surface lightly, only for it to refreeze at night, creating a repeating cycle of wet cold that Nathan's ledger had marked as the dangerous phase for the store if ventilation is unstable. I did not fully grasp the meaning of that line until one morning when I went down to the tunnel to fetch wood and noticed something off. The air in the passage no longer felt dry and perfectly still as before, but carried a subtle heaviness, almost clinging to the skin. I ran my hand over the surface of a log near the entrance, and though it remained drier than anything outside, I could feel a very faint dampness that had not been there previously. That was enough to make me pause. I went back up to the cabin, took Nathan's ledger, and turned to the section where he wrote about humidity. He noted that if moisture in the store rose near 30%, the wood would begin to lose its seasoned state, and if prolonged, mold and reduced burning efficiency were inevitable. I had no precise measuring tools, but after a winter living in the dry air of the tunnel, my body had become sensitive enough to detect the change. I recalled the diagrams of the vent shafts, those ventilation pipes running from the tunnel up to the surface, 10 to 15 centimeters in diameter, positioned at calculated spots to create slow airflow. If even one became blocked, the entire balance of the system would collapse. I layered on more clothing, grabbed a shovel, and began searching for the vent locations on the hillside behind the cabin. Snow had receded enough to expose patches of damp soil and tree roots. I located one vent mouth relatively easily, where air still moved in and out lightly, but the second, farther and lower, showed almost no sign except a slight depression in the ground. I dug down layer by layer, through softer soil, then harder clay, and finally small stones. At about 1 meter, then 1.2 meters, I still had not reached the pipe. Sweat ran despite the cold air. My hands ached from the effort and from cracks not yet healed from winter. I stopped, rested, then dug again. When the shovel struck something unusually hard, not loose rock but a fixed structure, I knew I had found it. I cleared the soil around and exposed the vent mouth, almost completely buried by sliding earth and roots. Perhaps throughout the winter, snow and ice had kept it from collapsing further, but as thawing began, the soil softened and slid down, sealing the breathing path of the entire store. I used my hands, then a wooden stick, clearing bit by bit of dirt and root segments, gradually reopening the airway. The first air that escaped was not forceful, but enough for me to feel the difference, as though a sealed room had just been opened after many days. The work did not finish in one day. I returned every day, digging deeper, cleaning more thoroughly, widening the mouth to prevent reblocking. It took more than 2 weeks altogether, a few hours each day, in conditions where the soil was sometimes soft, sometimes hard. Some days light rain made everything slippery, some days cold wind numbed my hands after minutes. But I did not stop, because I understood that if the store lost its original state, those 20 cords would gradually become like any other outdoor pile existing, but no longer reliable when needed most. When I finished, the vent mouth was clear, the passage fully open, and when I went back down into the tunnel, the difference was clearer than any number. The air felt lighter, drier, without that faint clinging sensation on the skin. I touched the logs, and the sound when I tapped them together returned to its sharp, ringing clarity. If humidity had approached the danger threshold before, now it had returned to the safe zone below what Nathan had noted. I stood in the tunnel looking along the wood compartments and realized that throughout the winter, I had only been a user of the system Nathan and Elias left behind. But now, having restored by my own hands what had become clogged, I was no longer merely an inheritor. I was the one keeping that system alive. And, in a place where winter never truly ends, keeping something breathing was not just a technical detail. It was what determined whether you would enter the next winter with a reliable reserve or with a promise already failing from the inside. Spring passed without any clear moment to call the end of winter, only the cold retreating in small steps, soil softening underfoot, water beginning to flow in thin streams along low spots, and air no longer cutting into the lungs with each deep breath. By early summer 1877, the The small valley where the cabin sat grew quiet in a different way. Not the silence of cold, but the stillness of a rarely visited place where everything existed without needing witnesses. I had grown accustomed to working alone, to reading ledgers, checking the tunnel, maintaining airflow, and keeping everything in the state Nathan had calculated. But then, one afternoon, while I was rechecking a vent mouth I had cleared weeks earlier, I heard footsteps on the ground above, heavy, slow, and uneven, like those of an older person. When I emerged from the tunnel and came up into the cabin, I saw a man standing near the door, leaning on a wooden staff, shoulders slightly stooped, but his eyes sharp and observing every detail around him closely. He introduced himself as Jeremiah Flint, a stonemason who had worked in this region before Bannack had enough people to be called a town. He said he had passed by here many times in previous years and knew of this cabin, knew of Elias Wren and later Nathan, and when he saw signs of a recently dug vent, he wanted to see who was working on it. I did not answer right away, only invited him in and led him down to the tunnel. When the thick wooden door opened and we stepped into the passage, Jeremiah stopped almost immediately, not going farther but standing at the beginning, placing his hand on the stone wall and feeling it. He said nothing for a few seconds, then walked slowly along the compartments, touching the joints between stones, looking up at the vent shafts, and finally turning back to me with a look I had never seen from anyone in Bannack. Not mockery, not pity, but recognition. He said this system was not something commonly seen in Montana, but it was not without precedent. He had seen similar cellars farther east, where European immigrants brought their building methods, using earth and stone to maintain year-round stable temperatures, preserving food and materials in conditions the surface could not control. He called it a form of stone-insulated storage, where the mass and structure of the stone, combined with the overlying soil, created a natural thermal buffer, reducing temperature swings and keeping the interior unaffected by external cold or heat. He explained that when stones were laid dry without mortar, the small gaps between them allowed moisture to escape while maintaining structural stability, and when combined with properly placed vents, air moved slowly enough not to carry away too much heat, yet fast enough to prevent moisture buildup. I stood listening, and for the first time what I had read in Nathan's and Elias's ledgers was placed in a broader framework of understanding, not just the experience of two men, but part of a building tradition that had existed long before. Jeremiah did not dwell much on theory after that. He began pointing out points where the system could be improved. A corner of wall where stones did not fit perfectly and might lose stability over years. A vent section needing extra protection at the mouth to prevent earth sliding in during heavy rain. A floor spot that could be recompacted for better drainage. He did not do the work for me but showed me how to select stones, how to place them so their weight held each other, how to use small pieces to wedge gaps without rigidifying the entire structure. In the days that followed, he returned a few times, each visit brief but enough for me to learn step by step. I learned to read soil with my hands, to feel moisture and compaction. I learned to look at a stone wall and know which spot would weaken after another winter. I learned to work slowly and precisely rather than fast and then repair later. We did not expand the tunnel or change the original design of Nathan and Elias, but reinforced, optimized, and made the system function as it was meant to. In the process, I realized something I had only vaguely sensed before. What Nathan did was not a single idea, but the continuation of a deeper understanding of how people could live in harsh environments by respecting physical laws rather than fighting them. When Jeremiah stood at the tunnel entrance one late summer afternoon looking over the entire system and nodding lightly, I understood that his recognition was worth more than any apology from Bannack. And when he said, "You are not just keeping what they built, you are learning to become the next one who understands it," I knew this cabin, once called the Wren Winter Grave, had become something else. Not merely a place to survive, but a place where a system was passed on, understood, and kept alive. As summer receded and the first autumn winds of 1877 began carrying the familiar cold from the north, I knew I could not continue living completely cut off from the outside world, not because the cabin was insufficient for me, but because the system Nathan and Elias left was not just to keep one person alive but sufficient to create value others would soon recognize whether they wanted to or not. I loaded the first logs onto a simple handcart, secured them with old rope, and began the journey from Beaverhead County down to Bannack, along the same path I had traveled months earlier with nearly empty hands. This time I pulled what the whole town had once laughed at. When I arrived, I did not stand in the probate office, but outside the door of Milton Graves, where people bought and sold everything from nails and salt to rumors. I set down a small portion of my wood and told him I was selling at $4 a cord, in the middle of the $3 to $5 range. Bannack still traded at not higher but not lower. Milton looked at the pile, then at me, then smiled the way he smiled when he thought he held the upper hand. He said people could cut their own wood cheaper, that no one needed to buy from a widow hauling what he called doomsday wood, and that if Nathan Wren were alive, he might have sold the land outright for quick cash instead of burying money in the ground. I did not argue. I only took a few sticks, handed them to him, and said he could try them. He did not refuse, not because he believed me, but because he liked having another story to tell customers. Others in the store began calling me by the name that later spread through town: Doomsday Widow, the Apocalypse Widow selling wood dug from underground like some secret asset. But when Milton put those sticks in his stove and lit them, the story began to change in a way no one could laugh off immediately. The wood caught quickly, burned steadily, and more importantly, produced noticeably higher heat than what he usually used. Little smoke, no crackling pops from moisture, and after a time far less ash remained. A few people nearby noticed before they could think of the next snide remark. I did not say my wood was 30% better. I did not need to. People who burned fires every day could feel the difference themselves, and they began asking where I got the wood, how it stayed so dry, and why it was unlike any woodpile they had seen. I did not explain everything. I sold small portions, enough to keep interest, but not enough to reveal the whole system. In the weeks that followed, I returned to Bannack several times, each time bringing a little more, and each time the number of buyers grew, not because they believed my story, but because they believed their stoves. Not everyone saw opportunity in it, however. Some still laughed, still called me the Doomsday Widow, still said I was selling an idea more than wood, and that when winter came, everything would go back to normal. Cyrus Doyle, who had once loaned Nathan money for materials, met me once near the store and reminded me of the old debt, suggesting I could settle it quickly by selling part of the mountainside land he believed had no real value. I refused, not with loud words, but by showing him a stick of wood and asking whether he wanted payment in cash or in what winter would need more. But the most important observer was neither Milton nor Cyrus. One afternoon, while I was delivering a small load to a family near the end of the street, an older man, dressed neater than most around, approached and asked questions unlike any I had heard before. He did not ask price first. He asked about the wood's moisture content, where I stored it, about temperature and storage conditions. He introduced himself as Samuel Pike, a science teacher in Bannack who also recorded regional weather. I led him to the wood and let him inspect it himself. He took 2 sticks, tapped them together, listened to the sound, examined the cut surfaces, and then said this was wood preserved at low humidity, possibly under 20%, something nearly impossible to maintain consistently outdoors in Montana through winter. He did not laugh. He did not call me the Doomsday Widow. He said if what I was doing was real, this was not just about selling wood, but a method of fuel management. He asked if I would be willing to show him the system. I did not answer immediately. I looked around Bannack, where months earlier I had stood hearing people laugh at me, and realized the confrontation was no longer about whether they believed me, but about whom I chose to let see what Nathan and Elias had built. Finally, I nodded. Not because I needed their recognition, but because I understood that when winter returned, what they called doomsday might no longer be a joke. And then the difference between an outdoor pile and an underground system would no longer be a matter of belief, but a matter of who stayed warm enough to keep living. What happened in late fall 1877 was unlike any winter Bannack had experienced before, not because temperatures dropped lower, but because the way the weather shifted broke everything the community relied on to survive. Cold rains began in late November. Not ordinary rain, but freezing rain, liquid water that froze instantly on contact with any surface. At first, people did not see it as a major problem, but after only a few days, everything outside was coated in thick ice from roofs and fences to the woodpiles every family still believed would carry them through winter. As temperatures continued falling below -20 degrees Celsius, then hitting -30 degrees Celsius on strong wind nights, that ice did not melt away but hardened into a shell, locking all outdoor wood in place. The logs were no longer fuel. They became frozen blocks, heavier, wetter, and nearly impossible to chop or split without many times the normal effort. Families began realizing it too late. They brought wood inside, tried to burn it, but what ignited was not heat but smoke and disappointment. Frozen damp wood in the stove produced only weak fire, insufficient to warm the space, and consumed large amounts of fuel without corresponding efficiency. Within weeks, a problem that had existed only on paper, burning efficiency, moisture, preservation, became the difference between a house that could hold heat and a house that was simply a cold box with a fire inside. Bannack began to change. No more loud laughter in Milton Graves's store. Instead, short, tense exchanges about who still had dry wood, who could trade food for fuel, and who had begun cutting back night fires to conserve. Families who once believed 6 to 8 cords sufficient started realizing that number meant nothing when most of their wood could not be used effectively. Some tried re-chopping frozen logs, but each axe swing not only exhausted strength but shattered wood uncontrollably into pieces harder to burn. Others tried bringing wood indoors to thaw, but in sub-zero conditions the process was so slow it was nearly useless. The community entered what I can only call severe fuel shortage, not because they lacked wood, but because they no longer had usable wood. I returned to the cabin before the ice rains grew worst, and when true winter closed in, I stood in my tunnel where there was no ice, no wind, no sudden temperature shifts. The ventilation system I had restored in spring continued working steadily, keeping humidity low below the threshold Nathan had noted. The logs remained dry, still rang sharp when tapped together, and when I carried them up to the cabin and burned them, the flame was steady, strong, and controllable. While outside temperatures could plummet to minus 30 degrees Celsius inside the cabin, I maintained enough heat to prevent complete freezing, usually hovering around 35 degrees Celsius without heavy burning and higher when needed. I did not have to burn continuously as in the previous winter. Thanks to what I had learned, I kept a stable heat core, reduced losses, and used fuel calculatedly. But the biggest difference was not in temperature numbers. It was in stability. Outside, everything changed with each gust, each ice rain. Inside, Nathan and Elias's system kept everything within a range I could predict and control. And in a winter where instability killed fastest, that predictability was worth more than any amount of fuel. News from Bannack reached me infrequently, but enough to understand the situation. Some families had to abandon cabins midwinter not because they ran out of wood, but because they could not use what they had. Some fell ill from smoke produced by burning damp wood in enclosed spaces. Some nights the town's lights dimmed noticeably, not because people did not need warmth, but because they lacked efficient fuel to sustain it. And in those stories, the name Doomsday Widow began appearing in a different tone. No longer mockery, but acknowledgement they did not voice outright. I did not return to Bannack during the coldest months. I stayed in the cabin, maintaining the system, checking vents, checking humidity, and burning wood so each stick served a clear purpose. There were nights when strong winds made the cabin tremble lightly, and I remembered the laughter in the probate room, remembered the 10 to 12 cord figure they called standard. 20 cords underground was not just a larger number. It was an entirely different system. And when the winter of 1878 reached its harshest point, when everything outside nearly collapsed in ways no one in Bannack had predicted, my cabin was not a place without cold, but a place where cold no longer decided everything. In a winter when many began to understand apocalypse was not exaggeration, but a very real state of lost control, I stood in my small space and realized what Nathan prepared for was not one specific winter. It was designed for winters others did not prepare for. When winter finally released its grip, not with a clear moment, but with repeating small signs, water running under ice, soil gradually softening, light stretching longer each hour, spring 1878 came to Bannack. Unlike any previous spring, it was not just the end of cold, but the end of an illusion the community had clung to too long, that having wood was enough to survive winter. What they had just endured proved the opposite. And in the first weeks when paths began reopening and people could move between cabins without battling ice and wind, I returned to Bannack, not with a cart of wood to sell, but with trips carrying what the past winter had turned into, the most valuable asset. I did not bring my entire store, but enough to make a difference for families I knew had been hit hardest. There were cabins where when I stepped inside, the fire had long gone out because they had nothing left to burn effectively, even though outside frozen wood piles still remained unthawed. I did not say much. I simply gave wood, showed them how to select the right sticks, how to start fires without waste, and how to retain heat better with what they had. A few people at first kept distance not because they did not need help, but because they were not used to receiving from someone they had once laughed at. But the cold of the past winter had changed many things, and raw need quickly overrode what remained of pride. Within weeks, cabins near my area no longer went completely fireless at night as before, and more importantly, no more cases of people abandoning homes simply because they could not stay warm. The town's record keepers, including Samuel Pike, began noting it not as a personal story but as an observable change. In areas with access to properly preserved wood and rational usage methods, no additional direct cold-related deaths occurred in the late winter and early spring phase. That was not a miracle. It was the result of a system no one had valued before. Jeremiah Flint returned to the cabin once more in late spring, this time not to repair but to see how what we had done over the past year had held up. He walked through the tunnel, inspecting stone walls, vents, and nodded in his familiar way. But this time, he said what mattered was not only that the system remained intact, but that it had been used correctly under the harshest possible conditions. Samuel Pike also came, bringing his notebooks, asking more detailed questions not just about structure but about operation through each winter stage. He began calling what he saw a method, not in a purely theoretical sense but as a repeatable set of principles. Preserving fuel underground to maintain humidity below efficiency thresholds, using the thermal mass of earth and stone for temperature stability, and controlling airflow to balance ventilation and heat retention. He wrote it down not as a story about a widow, but as a lesson others could apply. The name Wren Method appeared for the first time in those notes, not because I named it, but because he used it to refer to the approach Elias and Nathan had developed and I had continued. When I stood at the valley's edge, looking down at Bannack one late spring afternoon, I saw small but clear changes. A few cabins began digging shallower cellars, experimenting with keeping wood not entirely outdoors. Some built additional covers for woodpiles, no longer leaving them fully exposed to rain and ice. Conversations in town no longer centered on who had how many cords, but began shifting to how to keep that wood truly usable when needed. Not everyone changed immediately, and not everyone believed fully. But what mattered was they had seen a winter where the old way was no longer enough. And with living proof right before them, they began to listen. The cabin on the mountainside, once called the Winter Grave, was no longer a symbol of isolation or failure. It became a reference point, a place people mentioned when talking about surviving winter, not just through endurance, but through understanding. And when I turned back inside, stepped down into the familiar tunnel, touched the cold but stable stones, heard the dry sound of wood. When tapped together, I understood that the legacy Nathan left was not in the number 20 chords, but in changing how a community thought about survival, and for the first time, I no longer felt I was living in someone else's system. I was part of it. If you want to explore more real survival stories and seemingly impossible solutions, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos. Thank you for watching. See you in the next journey.